I wondered what she would say if I proposed. The alien woman suddenly turned around and said yes. Adrian's wrench slipped for the third time that morning, clanging against the ion drive's housing with a sound that made his teeth ache. He swore quietly, wiping coolant off his knuckles with a rag that had given up any pretense of cleanliness sometime during the previous administration. The maintenance bay of Epsilon outpost smelled like ozone and desperation, which he'd been told was standard for frontier colonies but still seemed unnecessarily poetic for what amounted to a scattered collection of prefab structures clinging to a rock nobody wanted. Kira appeared beside him without warning, the way she always did. Her footsteps made no sound on the metal grating, and Adrian had stopped jumping at her sudden materializations somewhere around month 3. She held out a smaller wrench, the correct size, before he'd finished cursing his mistake. "You're using the metric set on an imperial fitting again," she said, her voice carrying that particular combination of patience and amusement that suggested she'd been watching him struggle for educational purposes. "In my defense," Adrian replied, accepting the tool, "whoever designed these ships clearly wanted future mechanics to suffer." He fitted the wrench properly this time, feeling the satisfying catch as it gripped. "Also, it's too early for competence. The larger sun isn't even fully up yet." Kira's elongated ears twitched slightly, a gesture he'd learned meant she was suppressing a smile. Her skin caught the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the bay, that impossible blue that reminded him of deep water and vacation brochures he couldn't afford. "Helios Prime achieved full visibility 17 minutes ago. You're just not a morning person." "I'm barely an afternoon person," Adrian muttered, torquing the bolt with more force than strictly necessary. "I'm essentially a theoretical concept of a person until at least 1000 hours. The ion drive hummed reluctantly to life, sounding like a cat being forced into a bath. Kira tilted her head, those distinctive ears rotating slightly to catch the frequency. "Coupling assembly is misaligned. 43 degrees off center, I think." Adrian consulted his diagnostic tablet, which confirmed her assessment with irritating precision. "You know, normal people use instruments to measure these things." "I am using instruments," she said, tapping one elongated ear. "Mine are just built in, more efficient." "Show off." But he was grinning as he made the adjustment. Their banter had developed its own rhythm over the months, a comfortable back and forth that made the tedious work almost enjoyable. Almost. The comm system crackled to life above them, and Marcus's voice echoed through the bay with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already consumed too much coffee. "Morning, lovebirds. How's our garbage fleet looking today?" Adrian felt heat creep up his neck. "We're professionals, Marcus. Professionals doing professional work. That's a lot of professionals for someone who just used the wrong wrench," Kira observed mildly. "Betrayed by my own partner," Adrian said, pressing a hand to his chest in mock injury. "I'm wounded. Professionally wounded." Marcus's laugh rattled the speakers. "Just get the shuttle operational by 1400. We've got a supply run, and I'd rather not spend another week eating those protein bars that taste like recycled regret." The comm clicked off, leaving them in relative quiet. The ion drive had settled into a more acceptable purr, and Adrian checked off another item on his endless maintenance list. 37 ships in various states of disrepair, and only 2 certified mechanics to keep them limping along. The Epsilon outpost director had called it a growth opportunity during orientation, which Adrian had since learned was administrative code for "we're desperately understaffed but can't afford to admit it." Kira moved to the next vessel, a cargo hauler that had been listing to port for 6 weeks. She ran her hands along the hull plating, fingers tracing patterns only she could perceive. "Hull integrity is compromised in Section 7. Microfractures from atmospheric stress. Can we patch it, or are we talking full replacement?" Adrian asked, already knowing they didn't have the materials for replacement. "Patch, reinforced with polymer sealant. It'll hold for another 3 months, maybe 4 if the dust storms stay light." "And if they don't stay light?" She looked at him then, those luminous eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Then we improvise. We're good at that." "We." The words settled into his chest with unexpected weight. Nearly a year of shared shifts, of handing each other tools and finishing each other's diagnostics, and he still felt that small jolt of satisfaction when she included him in that plural pronoun. They were good at improvising, at keeping impossible machinery running on insufficient parts and stubborn determination. Adrian gathered the polymer sealant supplies, arranging them with more care than the task required. He was acutely aware of Kira working beside him, the way her presence had become essential to his daily routine, as necessary as oxygen processors and radiation shielding. When had that happened? When had she shifted from colleague to something undefined, but infinitely more important? "You're thinking very loudly," Kira said without looking up from the hull section she was examining. "That's not a thing," Adrian replied automatically. "Isn't it?" She glanced at him, and something in her expression suggested she knew exactly what thoughts were cluttering his mind. But she simply returned to her work, leaving him to wonder what else those remarkable ears might be capable of perceiving. The Sunset Lounge had earned its name through optimism rather than accuracy, since the converted cargo container possessed exactly one small window that faced the wrong direction entirely. Someone had attempted to compensate by painting a lurid sunset mural across the back wall, though the artist had apparently never seen a sunset and was working from increasingly abstract descriptions. The result looked like a traffic accident between orange paint and purple regret. Adrian nursed something the settlement brewer called whiskey, though several star systems and any connection to actual grain separated it from the genuine article. It tasted like industrial solvent with ambition, but it was warm and created a pleasant numbness that took the edge off another 14-hour shift. "You look like you've been wrestling with the cargo haulers again," said Patricia, sliding into the seat across from him. She worked hydroponics, which meant her clothes always carried the faint scent of growing things and chemical fertilizers. "Did you win?" "I won the battle," Adrian said, raising his glass. "The war continues indefinitely." Marcus arrived with his usual lack of subtlety, dropping into a chair hard enough to make the whole table shudder. 3 more months until rotation," he announced to nobody in particular. 3 more months of this paradise, and then I'm requesting assignment to literally anywhere else. I'm thinking ice mining, radiation-soaked asteroid processing, anything with less dust. "You say that every week," Patricia observed, "and every week it becomes more true." Marcus flagged down the server, a perpetually exhausted woman named Jean, who'd been on Epsilon so long she'd stopped counting contracts. "The usual, please, and maybe some of those fried things if the kitchen hasn't caught fire again." Kira entered the lounge with her characteristic silence, and Adrian felt his awareness sharpen despite the synthetic whiskey. She'd changed from her work coveralls into casual clothes that still somehow seemed more elegant than anyone else's. Several conversations paused as she passed, not from hostility, but from that instinctive human response to difference, the momentary recalibration required when confronted with blue skin and those remarkable ears. She caught his eye and smiled, moving to join their table. Adrian tried not to notice how his heart rate increased, which was difficult because his heart was being extremely obvious about the whole situation. "Kira!" Marcus greeted her with the over-enthusiastic friendliness of someone determined to prove they weren't bothered by alien colleagues. "Join us in our ritual complaining. It's very human. You'll love it." "I complain regularly," Kira said, settling into the remaining chair. "Just this morning I complained about someone using metric tools on Imperial fittings." "That was a targeted attack," Adrian protested. "I'm feeling very attacked right now." Patricia laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "How long have you two been working together now? 10 months? 11, Kira and Adrian said simultaneously, then glanced at each other. Adrian felt heat creeping up his neck again, which seemed to be happening with increasing frequency. Marcus leaned forward with the expression of someone about to say something regrettable. "So, Kira, I've been curious. On your homeworld, do people, date? Like, is that a thing? Or do you have some kind of arranged situation? Or maybe a seasonal mating ritual? Or—" "Marcus," Patricia said sharply. "What? I'm asking respectfully. It's cultural exchange." Kira's ears tilted slightly, and Adrian had spent enough time with her to recognize restrained amusement. "We have what you'd call dating, yes, though the courtship process involves significantly more poetry than I've observed here." "Poetry?" Marcus looked horrified. "Like actual poetry? That you have to write yourself?" "Typically, yes. Though exceptionally bad poetry is considered more endearing than technically proficient verse, it demonstrates sincerity. Adrian filed this information away with the kind of care usually reserved for critical ship specifications, then immediately felt ridiculous for doing so. "I can barely write a maintenance report," Marcus said. "I'd be doomed on your world. Forever alone, dying surrounded by unimpressed aliens who found my syntax lacking." "Your syntax is already lacking," Patricia pointed out. Jean arrived with drinks and a plate of something that had been fried with more enthusiasm than skill. The conversation shifted to safer topics. The upcoming supply ship, rumors of better entertainment modules, Patricia's ongoing war with a fungal infection in the tomato section. Adrian participated peripherally, too aware of Kira beside him, the way her shoulder nearly touched his when she reached for her glass. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly, pitched for his ears alone. "Long day," he replied, which wasn't untrue but also wasn't the complete answer. The complete answer involved thoughts he didn't quite know how to articulate, questions about whether the warmth he felt around her was reciprocated or just wishful interpretation of professional friendliness. "The hauler should be fully operational tomorrow," Kira continued. "The polymer sealant is setting well. Better than I expected, actually." "We make a good team," Adrian said, then immediately wondered if that sounded too casual or not casual enough. Human communication was exhausting. He had no idea how to navigate the gap between what he wanted to say and what was safe to express. Kira's luminous eyes met his, and for a moment he could have sworn she was about to say something significant. But Marcus chose that exact instant to launch into a story about the time he'd accidentally vented an entire cargo bay into space, and the moment dissolved into laughter in the comfortable chaos of shared company. Later, walking back to his quarters through the settlement's dim corridors, Adrian replayed the evening in his mind. The way Kira had smiled at his jokes, the casual brush of her hand when they'd both reached for the fried thing simultaneously. The look in her eyes that might have been curiosity or might have been something deeper. He was definitely overthinking this. Probably. Almost certainly. His quarters were small and spare, containing a bunk, a storage locker, and a tiny desk where he never did paperwork. He lay down without bothering to change, staring at the ceiling panels and their fascinating pattern of water stains from a leak that had been fixed before he'd arrived. Somewhere in the settlement, Kira was probably doing the same, though her quarters were better maintained and she actually used her desk. What would she say if he asked? The question formed unbidden, consuming and impossible. Not just asked her to dinner or some other casual escalation, but really asked. Asked her to build something permanent in this temporary place, to choose him deliberately and completely. The thought terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. The observation deck occupied the highest point of Epsilon outpost's main structure, a transparent dome that provided 360-degree views of the alien landscape. Adrian had discovered it during his second week, drawn by the promise of somewhere, anywhere, that didn't smell like machine oil and recycled air. He'd expected solitude. Instead, he'd found Kira standing at the central window, silhouetted against the setting suns. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" he'd asked, already preparing to retreat. She'd turned, those elongated ears catching the fading light. "The universe is interrupting itself constantly. You're just participating in the natural order." He'd stayed. Somehow it had become their unplanned ritual. Now, months later, Adrian climbed the access ladder with the familiarity of routine. His shift had ended 20 minutes ago, and he'd spent 19 of them pretending he wasn't specifically timing his arrival to coincide with hers. Very casual, extremely professional. Kira was already there naturally, standing at their usual spot. She'd beaten him by perhaps 30 seconds, which meant either her shift had ended earlier or she'd also been doing elaborate mental calculations about acceptable arrival times. He chose to believe the latter because it made him feel less ridiculous. "Helios Prime is doing that thing again," she said without turning around. Adrian joined her at the window, maintaining the careful distance they'd established, close enough to share the moment, far enough to preserve plausible deniability of intent. The larger sun was indeed doing that thing, its orange-red surface roiling with prominent storms that painted the atmosphere in shades that Earth's sky had never managed. The smaller companion sun, Helios Minor, added violet undertones to the whole display, creating a color palette that would have sent Earth's painters into fits of inadequacy. I've been here almost a year, Adrian said, and I still can't decide if it's beautiful or just weird. Why not both? Kira tilted her head, ears rotating slightly to catch some sound he couldn't perceive. On my homeworld, we have 3 moons that align every 47 days. When they do, the tidal forces create bioluminescent blooms across the entire Western Hemisphere. The ocean glows blue-green for 3 nights straight. That sounds actually beautiful. Not beautiful, but also weird. You haven't seen the sea creatures that surface during the blooms. They have 17 eyes and attitudes about personal space. Adrian laughed, the sound echoing softly in the dome. Okay, beautiful and weird. I'm convinced. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the suns sink toward the jagged mountain range that dominated the western horizon. This was Adrian's favorite part of the day. These stolen minutes where the universe narrowed to just the 2 of them in the alien sky. No maintenance logs, no failing systems, no careful navigation of what could or couldn't be said. Do you miss it? He asked. Your homeworld, I mean. The glowing oceans and judgmental sea creatures. Kira considered this longer than he expected. Sometimes. Mostly I miss the food. The protein bars here taste like construction materials. That's because they basically are construction materials. I'm pretty sure I saw the same ingredients listed on a hull sealant container. That would explain the texture. She paused, then added more quietly, I miss my family. My younger sister just started her engineering certification. I'm missing watching her struggle with the same courses that made me want to quit. You want to quit? I don't believe it. Oh, I was terrible at first. Completely hopeless. My instructors suggested I consider alternative career paths, which is academic language for, please stop destroying our equipment. Her expression softened with memory. But I was stubborn, mostly to prove them wrong, if I'm honest. Spite is an excellent motivator, Adrian agreed. I'm spite-powered at least 60% of the time. What about you? Kira turned to face him more directly, and Adrian's careful distance suddenly felt like a chasm. Do you miss Earth? I've never actually been to Earth, he admitted. I was born on a station orbiting Mars, raised on a mining colony near Titan. Earth is more like a concept to me than a real place. The birthplace of humanity, swimming in oceans I've only seen in videos. So we're both far from home, Kira said, just in different directions. Yeah. The word came out softer than he intended. Yeah, I guess we are. Helios Prime touched the mountain peaks, spilling light across the valley in golden streams. The observation deck's environmental systems hummed quietly, maintaining the precise temperature and pressure that kept them comfortable in the hostile atmosphere outside. Adrian wondered what it would be like to stand on a world where the air didn't actively want to kill you, where you could just walk outside without checking your suit seals 3 times. Can I ask you something? Kira's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Sure. Why did you come here? To Epsilon, I mean. It's not exactly a premium posting. Adrian laughed, but it came out hollow. I needed the money, student loans from a degree I'm not using, medical bills from when my brother got sick. He's fine now, he added quickly, seeing her concern. But the bills weren't fine. Epsilon offered triple hazard pay and expedited debt relief. So here I am, fixing ships on a rock in the middle of nowhere. That's admirably practical. It's admirably desperate, he corrected, though I'll admit it's had unexpected benefits. Such as, he gestured at the view, at the impossible sunset, painting the alien landscape in colors that Earth had never known. Such as this, such as learning that I'm actually pretty good at keeping garbage ships running, such as, he stopped himself before finishing the thought, before saying, such as you. But Kira's ears had tilted forward, and her luminous eyes held his with an intensity that made his breath catch. Such as discovering that protein bars that taste like construction materials are marginally better when you're complaining about them with someone else, he said, deflecting with humor because the truth felt too large and too fragile. Coward, she said, but she was smiling. Absolutely, Adrian agreed. Cowardice is my natural state. I'm very accomplished at it. The suns continued their descent, and Adrian allowed himself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to close that careful distance, to reach for her hand, to speak the words that had been building in his chest for months. But the moment stretched and passed, and they remained as they were. Two people from different worlds, watching alien suns set over a frontier neither had chosen, but both had come to inhabit. The alarm cut through Adrian's sleep like a plasma torch through hull plating, dragging him from dreams he couldn't quite remember into a reality that was immediately, aggressively worse. Red emergency lights strobed across his quarters, and the automated voice that only activated during genuine catastrophes informed him with irritating calm that the atmospheric processor had experienced a critical failure. "Of course it has," Adrian muttered, rolling out of his bunk and grabbing his work coveralls. "Why would it fail during a convenient time? That would be unreasonable." The corridors were chaos in the organized way that frontier colonies practice for but never quite mastered. Colonists moved toward emergency shelters with expressions ranging from annoyed to terrified, while the settlement's skeleton crew of essential personnel rushed in the opposite direction. Adrian spotted Marcus shepherding a group of newcomers who looked approximately 3 seconds from panic. "Processors down hard," Marcus shouted over the alarms. "They're saying we've got maybe 90 minutes of reserve." "Fantastic," Adrian called back. "I've always wanted to die on schedule." He reached the maintenance level to find Kira already there, her blue skin looking almost purple in the emergency lighting. She'd beaten him by maybe 2 minutes and had already pulled up the diagnostic interface, her fingers dancing across the holographic display with controlled urgency. "Tell me something good," Adrian said, grabbing his toolkit from the locker. "The failure originated in the primary carbon scrubber," Kira replied, not looking up from the readings. "Cascade effect took out the backup filtration system and the emergency thermal regulators." "I specifically asked for something good. We're not dead yet. That's technically good." "Your optimism is inspiring," Adrian said, moving to her side to examine the data. "The readings were catastrophically bad, exactly as advertised. We need to bypass the primary system entirely and reroute through the secondary processing array, which hasn't been used in 3 years and probably has more dust than functional components," Kira finished. "See, now you're getting into the spirit of frontier living. The maintenance tunnel leading to the processor core was narrow enough that they had to move single file, ducking under pipes that dripped condensation and stepping over junction boxes that sparked with what Adrian hoped was normal electrical discharge. The air already tasted stale, his brain helpfully informing him that carbon dioxide levels were rising, even though intellectually he knew it was too early for noticeable effects. "On a scale of 1 to completely doomed," Adrian said, "where are we?" 7, Kira replied. "Maybe 8 if the secondary array is worse than I'm expecting." "What would get us to a 10? If the hull breached simultaneously?" "Please don't say things like that. The universe is listening, and it has a terrible sense of humor." They reached the processor core to find it in slightly better condition than complete disaster, which Adrian was choosing to interpret as a victory. The primary scrubber had failed so comprehensively that components had melted together in ways that would fascinate material scientists and horrify safety inspectors. Smoke drifted from several junction points, and the whole assembly radiated heat that made the air shimmer. "Right," Adrian said, staring at the mechanical carnage. "So, we're at an 8, possibly 8.5. Kira had already moved to the secondary array, pulling access panels with practiced efficiency. "I need you to reroute power from the primary coupling while I bypass the thermal controls. We'll have to force the secondary system online manually." "Manually as in the dangerous way that training specifically tells us not to do?" "Do you have a better option?" "Not even slightly." They worked with the synchronized efficiency that months of partnership had created, Adrian's hands finding the right connections, while Kira called out voltage readings and temperature thresholds. The tunnel was getting noticeably warmer, sweat running down his back and making his coveralls stick uncomfortably. "Power coupling is accessible," Adrian said, gripping the heavy connector with both hands. "This is going to arc impressively when I pull it." "Wait for my signal," Kira said, her voice tight with concentration. "I need to have the bypass ready, or we'll just blow the secondary system too." "No pressure or anything." Actually, quite a lot of pressure, the atmospheric kind specifically. Adrian laughed despite himself, despite the alarm still wailing and the oxygen counter in his peripheral vision ticking down with relentless precision. This was objectively terrible, and somehow Kira's deadpan humor made it bearable. Ready, she said. On three, one. Wait, on three or after three? On three. Just clarifying. I'd hate to die because of counting confusion. Two. Adrian positioned himself, muscles tensed. Three. He yanked the coupling free, and the universe rewarded his effort with an arc of electricity that turned his vision white and made his teeth vibrate. The smell of ozone flooded the tunnel, and for one terrible second, he thought they'd failed, that he'd just destroyed their last option. Then Kira's triumphant shout cut through the ringing in his ears. It's working! The secondary array is cycling up. Adrian slumped against the wall, hands shaking from adrenaline and residual electrical current. Is this the part where we high-five, or are we still in danger? Still in danger, Kira said, already moving to the next connection point, but slightly less danger than before. Maybe a 6.5 now. I'll take it. They spent the next 40 minutes completing the bypass, their hands meeting repeatedly in the cramped space as they passed tools and components. At one point, a pressure seal threatened to give way, and Kira's hand closed over his with startling strength, her fingers wrapping around his as they forced the mechanism back into alignment together. The contact sent electricity through him that had nothing to do with the sparking equipment, her skin warm against his, even through the heat of the tunnel. Got it, she said, but her hand lingered for just a moment longer than necessary before pulling away. The atmospheric processor wheezed to life like an elderly cat with emphysema, but the readings began stabilizing. Oxygen levels stopped dropping. The alarm finally, mercifully, shut off. They emerged from the tunnel to find Marcus waiting, his expression cycling between relief and exhaustion. Please tell me we're not going to die. Not today, Adrian said. Check back tomorrow. We're taking this whole survival thing one crisis at a time. Adrian spent the day after the crisis moving through a haze of exhaustion that made everything slightly unreal. His hands still trembled occasionally from the electrical arc, and he discovered a spectacular bruise on his shoulder from where he'd slammed into the tunnel wall during the emergency. He wore it like a badge of honor, which Kira had described as aggressively masculine, in a tone that suggested she was both amused and exasperated. The settlement had returned to its normal rhythm of barely controlled chaos. People nodded at him and Kira in the corridors, with the kind of respect reserved for those who'd prevented collective suffocation, which was flattering, but also meant he couldn't grab lunch without someone wanting to buy him a drink or describe in detail where they'd been when the alarm sounded. I'm starting to understand why heroes in stories always brood alone, Adrian told Kira as they escaped to the maintenance bay. It's not angst, it's just exhaustion from social interaction. You saved approximately 230 lives, Kira said, running diagnostics on a shuttle that had been complaining about its thruster alignment. You'll have to endure gratitude for at least a week. We saved 230 lives. This was very much a team effort. Fine. We'll endure gratitude together. Shared suffering. Adrian picked up his tablet, scrolling through the maintenance queue that had somehow grown despite the settlement nearly dying yesterday. Ships still needed fixing, systems still degraded, the universe maintained its relentless indifference to human crisis. He should have felt resentful, but instead there was something comforting about the routine, the return to normal after emergency. Except nothing felt quite normal anymore. Working beside Kira had always been easy, their partnership smooth and intuitive. But now he was hyper-aware of every moment their hands brushed, every time she leaned close to examine a component, the way her ears tilted toward him when he spoke. The crisis had stripped away some layer of pretense he hadn't realized he'd been maintaining, leaving everything raw and exposed. You're thinking loudly again, Kira said without looking up from her diagnostic scan. That's still not a thing, Adrian replied automatically, but his heart wasn't in the deflection. She did look up then, those luminous eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Isn't it? The question hung between them like a live wire, crackling with implication. Adrian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again in the impression of a particularly confused fish. I'm going to check the cargo hauler, he finally managed, fleeing to the relative safety of mechanical problems that didn't make his chest feel like it contained a small supernova. The cargo hauler welcomed him with its usual collection of issues. The polymer sealant they'd applied was holding beautifully, which meant Kira had been right about the structural integrity. She was usually right, which should have been annoying, but instead Adrian found it oddly reassuring. In a universe of failing systems and unexpected catastrophes, Kira's competence was a constant. He was elbow deep in the thruster assembly when she appeared beside him again, silent as always. "You're avoiding me," she said simply. "I'm avoiding my feelings," Adrian corrected. "You just happen to be involved in them." He hadn't meant to say that. The words escaped before his brain could properly vet them, and now they existed in the world, irretrievable and terrifying. Kira was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What feelings specifically?" Adrian slowly extracted himself from the thruster housing, buying time by wiping his hands on his coveralls with meticulous care. "The inconvenient kind. The kind that make working together complicated and potentially awkward." "I see." Her voice was carefully neutral, which was somehow worse than any other reaction. "And these inconvenient feelings, are they temporary? Side effects of crisis bonding and shared near-death experiences?" "No," Adrian said, meeting her eyes because if he was going to humiliate himself, he might as well do it properly. "They've been building for months, maybe since the beginning. I'm not actually sure when it started, just that somewhere between your third tool correction and your 40th insightful observation. I realized I was completely—" He stopped. The word caught in his throat. "Completely what?" "Invested," he finished, choosing the safest word he could find. "In this, in us working together, in you being here." Kira's ears rotated forward, a gesture he'd learned meant complete attention. "That's quite an admission for someone who specializes in cowardice. I'm branching out, trying new things. Being vulnerable is a growth opportunity, or so the settlement counselor keeps telling everyone." "The settlement counselor also suggested we solve stress through mandatory group meditation," Kira pointed out. "Her judgment is suspect." Adrian laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "Fair point. For what it's worth," Kira said, stepping closer and eliminating some of the careful distance he'd maintained, "I've also been experiencing inconvenient feelings. Quite persistently, actually." His heart, which had already been performing acrobatics, attempted a triple backflip. "Yeah? Yeah." She smiled, and it transformed her entire face into something that made Adrian forget how to breathe properly. "Though I've been waiting for you to say something first. My people have cultural traditions about courtship, and I wasn't sure how to translate them to human context without seeming presumptuous." "The poetry thing," Adrian remembered. "You mentioned poetry. Bad poetry specifically. The worse it is, the more sincere the feeling." "Well, I'm spectacularly unqualified for poetry," Adrian said. "I once wrote a haiku for school that my teacher described as an insult to syllables everywhere." "Perfect," Kira said, her eyes bright with amusement and something deeper. "That's exactly what I'm looking for." They stood there in the maintenance bay, surrounded by half-repaired ships and the smell of machine oil, and Adrian felt the careful walls he'd built over months crumbling with catastrophic efficiency. This was terrifying. This was impossible. This was happening anyway. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now?" Kira tilted her head, considering. "Now we finish fixing this hauler, because professional responsibilities don't disappear just because feelings are involved. And then maybe we continue this conversation somewhere without quite so many hydraulic fluid leaks." "Practical and romantic," Adrian said. "I'm impressed." "I contain multitudes," Kira replied. "Also, you have grease on your face." "Where?" She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "There." Her hand lingered, and Adrian covered it with his own, holding it against his face like it was something precious and breakable. The maintenance bay's fluorescent lights hummed above them, utterly unromantic and perfect. The observation deck had become their place in a way that needed no discussion or formal declaration. Adrian climbed the ladder that evening, with his heart performing complicated gymnastics that would have impressed Olympic judges. The maintenance bay conversation had shifted something fundamental between them, transformed the careful distance into deliberate closeness. but he still didn't quite know what that meant in practical terms. Kira was already there, naturally, standing at the window where Helios Prime and its smaller companion were beginning their nightly descent. She turned as he approached, and the smile that crossed her face made him forget whatever clever greeting he'd been planning. "Right on time," she said. "I'm evolving," Adrian replied, joining her at the window. "Soon I'll be punctual, responsible, maybe even organized. Let's not get carried away. I like you as you are." The casual affection in her voice did things to his cardiovascular system that probably violated several laws of biology. He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, the careful distance finally abandoned. The twin suns painted the horizon in their usual impossible colors, orange bleeding into violet in ways that Earth's atmosphere had never managed. Adrian had seen this view hundreds of times now, but it never quite lost its strangeness, its reminder that he was standing on a world that didn't care about human expectations of beauty or normalcy. "I've been thinking," Kira said quietly, "dangerous pastime, about what you said earlier, about being invested." She paused and her ears tilted in that way that meant she was choosing words carefully. "I came to Epsilon because I wanted to prove something. To my instructors who doubted me, to my family who worried I wasn't ready for frontier work. I wanted to be competent and independent and entirely self-sufficient." "You succeeded," Adrian said. "You're the most competent person on this entire rock." "Maybe, but somewhere in the process of proving I didn't need anyone, I discovered I wanted someone anyway." She turned to face him fully, her luminous eyes holding his. "Specifically, I wanted you." Adrian's brain temporarily ceased all higher functions. That's good. That's a good thing to want. Because I also want," he gestured vaguely between them, eloquence deserting him entirely. "You're very articulate," Kira observed, but she was smiling. "I'm having feelings. It's disrupting my language centers." She laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and reached for his hand. Her fingers intertwined with his, blue skin against his own, alien and familiar all at once. "I've been waiting for you to ask." "Ask what?" "The question you've been thinking for weeks, the one that gets louder every time we're alone together." Adrian's heart stopped, restarted, attempted a backflip. I didn't think I was that obvious." "You're not obvious to anyone else. But I can hear it. Not literally," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "But my people are sensitive to electromagnetic fields, to the bioelectric patterns that accompany strong emotions. When you're near me, when you're thinking about us, it's like..." She paused, searching for the right comparison. "Like standing next to a star going supernova, quiet to everyone else, but I can feel every pulse of it." "That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or slightly terrifying," Adrian managed. "I haven't decided which." "Both," Kira said. "Like the sunsets." He looked at her then, really looked, trying to commit this moment to memory with perfect clarity. Her blue skin catching the fading light, those distinctive ears tilted toward him in complete attention, the way her eyes held entire galaxies in their depths. This person from another world who had somehow become essential to his existence, who made frontier life bearable and then better than bearable, who knew his thoughts before he spoke them. The question formed in his mind with crystalline clarity, no longer frightening, but inevitable. What would she say if he asked her to stay? Not just on Epsilon for the duration of their contracts, but after. To choose him deliberately, to build something permanent in this temporary place. To tie their futures together despite coming from different worlds and different lives. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally voice the question that had been consuming him. But Kira turned before the words could form, facing him with sudden intensity that stopped his breath. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw understanding, recognition, the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. "Yes," she said softly, in perfect English. The word hung in the air between them like something solid and precious. Adrian's heart hammered against his ribs, confusion and hope warring in his chest. You didn't have to," Kira said, stepping closer until they were nearly touching. "I told you, I can feel it when you're thinking about us. And that question, the one you've been building toward for weeks, it's been getting louder every day." "How long have you known?" Adrian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her smile began slowly, transforming her features into something radiant. Since the day we met, you looked at me like I was a problem you wanted to solve, and then like I was a person you wanted to know, and then... She paused, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, where his heart was doing its best impression of a failing thruster. And then like I was someone you wanted to keep. That's mildly creepy when you phrase it that way, Adrian said, but he was grinning. You're the one broadcasting emotional radiation across multiple frequencies. I'm just receiving. Fair point. He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his heart. So you've known this whole time that I was falling for you, and you just let me stumble around being awkward and obvious? You weren't obvious, and I was waiting for you to be ready. My people believe in letting feelings develop naturally, in not forcing the moment before both people have arrived at the same conclusion. And we've arrived. We've arrived, Kira confirmed, though if you want to actually ask the question out loud, I'm happy to answer again. For the record, Adrian laughed, the sound slightly unsteady. Okay, Kira, would you stay? After our contracts end, after we're supposed to move on to the next posting, would you build something here with me? Something permanent? Yes, she said again. And this time when she smiled, it was like watching stars form. I've been saying yes in my head for 3 months. It's nice to finally say it to your face. He kissed her then, there in the observation deck with the twin suns setting behind them and the whole alien universe watching. Her lips were warm against his, her hand curling into his shirt as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. She tasted like the coffee substitute they all pretended was acceptable, and something uniquely her, something he couldn't name but wanted to spend years learning. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Kira pressed her forehead against his. You know this means you're going to have to write me poetry now. Truly terrible poetry. It's traditional. I'm going to write you the worst poetry in human history, Adrian promised. It's going to make grown linguists weep. Perfect, Kira said, and kissed him again as the suns completed their descent and the alien stars emerged overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. They stood there as darkness settled over Epsilon outpost. Two people from different worlds who had found each other in the middle of nowhere, who had chosen each other despite every reasonable objection. The settlement hummed around them, ships waiting for repair, systems that would fail and be fixed and fail again, the endless cycle of frontier life. But none of that mattered in this moment. Here in the observation deck that had witnessed months of careful distance and unspoken longing, Adrian held Kira close and felt something slot into place in his chest. Some fundamental piece of himself that he hadn't known was missing. So what happens now, he asked, echoing his earlier question from the maintenance bay. Kira pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, her expression warm with affection and amusement. Now we go back to fixing ships and keeping this settlement running. We complain about protein bars and mock Marcus's terrible jokes. We watch the sunsets and write horrible poetry. She paused, her smile deepening. And we do it together, deliberately, for as long as we want. Forever sounds good, Adrian said. Forever sounds perfect, Kira agreed, and under the alien stars surrounded by the quiet hum of life support systems and the distant sounds of the settlement preparing for night, they began building their forever one moment at a time. 3 years later, Adrian still climbed to the observation deck every evening, though now Kira's hand was always in his, a gold band catching the light of twin suns that had become as familiar as breathing. The settlement had grown, new faces arriving to replace those who'd rotated home. But some things remained constant. Ships that needed fixing, systems that failed at inconvenient moments, and two mechanics who could finish each other's diagnostics without speaking a word. They'd written their poetry to each other, terrible, beautiful, sincere verses that made them laugh and made them cry, and proved that love didn't need perfection, only honesty. They'd built a life in a place neither had chosen, transforming a temporary posting into something permanent through the simple act of choosing each other, day after day, sunset after sunset. And sometimes when Adrian watched Kira's profile silhouetted against the alien sky, he wondered about the moments that change everything, the questions we're too afraid to ask, the distances we maintain because vulnerability feels too dangerous. How many connections do we miss because we wait for perfect courage that never comes? How many people stand beside us, already saying yes in their hearts, while we rehearse words we're too frightened to speak? Kira had heard his question before he asked it. But most of us aren't so lucky. Most of us have to risk the asking, to close the distance ourselves, to speak the words that terrify us. The universe doesn't offer guarantees, only possibilities. And the possibility of connection, of finding your person among infinite stars and impossible distances, is worth every moment of fear. Sometimes the person you're looking for is already looking back, waiting for you to be brave enough to ask. The end. Thank you for experiencing this journey with Sci-Fi Pulse. If this story touched you, made you think about the connections in your own life, or the questions you were hesitant to ask, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment to share your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment where someone